Theaters were chosen out of over 100 theaters that wanted to participate and were meant to represent the real breadth of the theatrical community. So they range from La Crosse Community Theater in La Crosse, Wisconsin, all the way up to Roundabout Theater, one of the largest arts nonprofits in the world, which is based in New York City. And so all of this was meant to help us understand how we can better talk about impact. But before you understand how to better talk about it, you kind of have to understand how we're talking about it right now. And so just a quick illustrative story. Last year I was invited to speak at the Americans for the Arts Conference and sit on a panel. And one of the other presenters on that panel with me was Frances Phillips, who's the program officer at the Haas Foundation, which is in Northern California. And she told a story about their evaluative process and how they've been asked to try and incorporate a method of evaluation that doesn't just look at economics, but the way that they're asked to do that is they have a one sheet that they use to evaluate every grant narrative that comes through the door, and that one sheet has a series of questions that they're meant to evaluate on a specific scale, 1 to 5, 1 to 7, something like that, based on how much the narrative seems to indicate that type of success. And one time she had a particular grant final report that she was looking at, and she evaluated it in a particular way. She gave it a certain set of scores. And then she lost the piece of paper on her desk, and she really had to turn in the grant report. So she, a couple of days later, when she couldn't find the piece of paper, she filled it out again, having re-looked at the grant report, and she filled out a series of scores. And then after she had turned it all in as she was cleaning up her desk, she found the first piece of paper, and she discovered that they were completely different scores. So that's kind of illustrative of the problem with impact assessment as it currently exists. If a foundation, for example, is even engaging in it at all, then they're engaging in it in an inexact way that becomes problematic. So to get into some of the data from our actual research, this is a graph of two different productions of the same show. So the show was Ruined, which is it won the Pulitzer Prize. It's a drama about female genital mutilation in the Congo. And this is two different productions that we were able to survey. And as you can see, the main reason that I wanted to show you this graph, if you look at the darker lines there, the darker colored lines, those are the actual audience response scores. And one thing that you can see is that they are almost identical between these two productions that were completely different. They had different directors. The only thing they had in common was the script. They occurred across the country from each other. And what's important there is to understand that there may actually be at the core of certain artistic products, so in this case a play, there may actually be an impact profile that you can actually access. So if, for example, you're creating a piece of art for the first time, but it's probably going to go out into the world and tour to other places, then you might be able to pass that along to other organizations who are going to do this work as a starting point for what the impact is likely to be. From an evaluative standpoint, it's possible that over time you could actually work from kind of a baseline understanding of what the impacts of a particular organization are, and then you could take a look at how those baseline impacts are related to a particular show or visual art piece or piece of music that organization received funding for or simply wanted to talk to their board about, things like that. So this is another one where type yes, please. Yes. So the answer to the question about the PowerPoint is I will, of course, give you the PowerPoint. I'll answer the other questions in a second. So to what extent did the show make you reflect on your own opinions or beliefs? So this is one of the questions that we asked for some of the companies. We had a total of about 60 questions that people could choose from. There were about 18 questions that were required, and then they were able to choose another 7 or so in order to fill out their survey. And the reason that I wanted to show you this is because of if it'll work, let's see. So it might not show that. Okay, so if you look at the two orange ones, show 24 and 25, and then you look at show 27, which is a couple over from there. So show 24 and 25, those are two productions by a major, what's called LORT, which just very large major regional theater in the country. And as you can see, there are scores on this particular question about making people reflect on their own opinions or beliefs, essentially having empathy for another point of view and having personal reflective time were pretty high. But then if you look at show 27, show 27 was from a very small company, a company that probably usually doesn't get a lot of funding attention, doesn't usually get a lot of critical attention, probably has a lot of trouble explaining their value to their overall community. And for them, they actually got a higher score than any other production that was measured on this metric. And they didn't have to have a huge budget to do it. They didn't have to have a very, very good development department to explain that particular impact. All they have to do with enough context is show people this graph and show people this score. And ideally, over time, that will mean something. Now, that of course is still, there we go. So that of course is still a long way away where they wouldn't have to give any kind of explanatory material along with this. But it's worth noting that one of the things that impact assessment does is it stops being about how good your development department is and starts being good about how good your work is. And as Shannon was saying in his introduction, one of the major parts of evaluation is setting goals and then working towards those goals and seeing how far you get. One of the things that impact assessment does, I think, for really the first time is it takes that idea and it implements it for the artistic product itself, as opposed to, say, for the marketing or the community engagement plan or the development plan. And so you are actually able to set goals for the art itself and then talk about whether you've reached those goals. This is another example. So this is, I'm going to go through three specific examples from our research. So this is at Woolly Mammoth Theater Company in Washington, D.C. They did a show called The Agony and Ecstasy of Steve Jobs, which some of you may have heard of. It's been in the news a lot. It was a show that is all about Apple and its bad human rights practices in China. And it was designed specifically to engage people in activism and to get them to do something about this problem. And so if you look at this light blue vector here, it's emotional. It's an emotional question about increased resolve. And the question basically said, to what extent did this production encourage you to give you increased resolve to make a change in your life? Which is a pretty high test. So that's 90 minutes after you walked in here. Are you so inspired that you are actually going to go out and make a change? And I think it's an even higher test when you take into account that change probably had to do with giving up your Apple device. But in this case, if you can take a look at the green dot there, you can see that it's a point to a point and a half higher than the scores that any other production in the entire study got on that question. And so for Woolly Mammoth, who has a mission of cultural activism, being able to show this score to people and being able to give context and give specific numeric evidence for what they say they're doing is an incredibly powerful tool for them. Looking at another show from Woolly Mammoth, this is a show called Booty Candy. And Booty Candy was a commissioned piece, I believe, by an African-American gay playwright in Washington, D.C. And it was about African-American gay culture. It was a very challenging piece that was written in episodic format. They broke the fourth wall. It was very non-traditional. And he was asked who he wanted in the audience as part of one of Woolly Mammoth's audience engagement initiatives. And he said that he wanted African-American churchgoers in his audience. Now that threw Woolly for a loop, but they went ahead and did it, and they got some churchgoers in there. The churchgoers were able to take the survey, and then one of the questions that they were asked was, what emotions were you feeling after the performance? And so this is a word cloud of the results of that, and as you can see, they were feeling very conflicted. They had happy responses, sad responses, they were confused and disappointed. And the thing that's interesting here is that for Woolly Mammoth, in context with Booty Candy, that's not a bad thing. That was actually a good outcome for them because they had such a schizophrenic audience. And so for them to be able to show this word cloud and then to accompany it with some explanatory material about what they were trying to do and why it was important to them to get different points of view and how they knew that there was going to be more conversation with more points of view makes a stronger case. So this last example, so this is Camino Real. Camino Real is is a late Tennessee Williams. It's very weird for Tennessee Williams. It's not at all your streetcar named Desire, and if you go in thinking that it is, you're going to be in trouble. And so this is a production that was done at the Theater at Boston Court in Los Angeles. And what I'm going to show you here, so this is actually a radar chart from our database that we developed. And just to kind of draw your attention to what we're interested in here, the pink pentagon in the middle there, that's the impact scores that they got for Camino Real. It's a very odd piece, and they overlaid an extra layer of very oddness. And they saw that they were getting half a point to a point lower on all of their impact scores, and that worried them. And so I worked with them for an hour to an hour and a half, not very much time, looking through their data in order to try and understand if there were practical things that they could do in response to this decline in impact. So the first thing that we looked at was one of the captivation indicators, and we did see that their captivation scores for Camino Real were lower than their other two shows. Right off the bat, what that means is that the other impacts will by definition be lower, because the people are not able to be as absorbed in the show. And so the Theater at Boston Court became very concerned about what they could do to try and increase that captivation, or at least decrease the distraction that was keeping people from being fully captivated. So we took a look at that same question about emotional response, and we saw that there were some words that they were not happy about. So there was confusion and there was disappointment. And whereas with Booty Candy that was a good outcome, in this case that was not a good outcome for them. They weren't hoping that people would be confused or disappointed, and so they found themselves trying to figure out ways to understand what that confusion and disappointment was based in and how they might solve it. The next thing that we did was we looked at what we call the unanswered questions question. This is a question that says, did you leave the performance with questions that you would have liked to ask the actors, director, or playwright? And 35% of people across the board say that they have unanswered questions. In this case, 68% of Camino Real's audience had unanswered questions. Now, unanswered questions are not inherently good or bad, but one thing that they do is they give you insight into what is going on in a person's head. And in this case, 98% of the people who said that they had unanswered questions actually told them what some of those unanswered questions were. And that's where the problem kicks in. Because if you look at what the unanswered questions were, there are things like, what the heck was this play about? I don't understand what I just saw. Many of the choices were bizarrely inexplicable. What was happening? These are really fundamental questions about the play that don't allow, if they can't get past what they're seeing in terms of understanding the nature of it, then they can't get into the deeper questions that Theater at Boston Court was really hoping for. And so looking at these questions, Theater at Boston Court wanted to understand if there were ways that they could actually engage people in answering those questions either for themselves or through curatorial insight by having the artistic directors or the director answer them for them. So we took a look at, and this is the main question, how can you create clarity while maintaining artistic impact? Because one of the problems that Theater at Boston Court has is that they have a philosophy of not providing too much mediation for the artistic experience. They don't like giving their audience a lot of help as they're experiencing the art. So we took a look at another aspect of post-performance engagement, which is reading the program book. And overall, we found that about half of audiences across all 58 productions that we surveyed use the program as a method of engaging after the show is over. And so in that context, the program becomes a talisman for the experience that people have had. It's the only thing that's left after they leave the theater to remind them of what they've experienced. And so, for example, it's very problematic if they go back to look in that program and they don't find anything that is actually helping them to parse the experience that they had after the fact. So in this case, 53% of people, right on the average, read their program book more closely after the performance, a higher number than any other production that Boston Court surveyed. And so that gets us to this question of why engage audiences in critical feedback and how to have a conversation with them.